1848. Europe was burning. Kings were afraid, and the people demanded freedom. Napoleon was dead, but the ideas he spread still haunted the streets of Europe. Europe's kings believed they had restored the old order, but they failed to see the coming storm. In 1848, the flames of nationalism, freedom, and revolution would sweep across the continent. In 1815, Europe's kings gathered together. They wanted to restore the order changed by Napoleon. In 1815, Europe's kings gathered together. They wanted to restore the order changed by Napoleon. Censorship increased. Newspapers were shut down. Armies kept the people under pressure. But the ideas of freedom were not dead. The fire of revolution was silently growing across Europe. In the 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Factories were growing, and cities were covered in smoke. Workers labored for 14 hours a day. Children were dying inside factories. In the 1840s, an economic crisis began. Bread prices soared. The people of Europe faced hunger. Now, it was not only those demanding freedom. The hungry also wanted revolution. In 1848, the fire of revolution exploded in Paris. The streets quickly filled with barricades. King Louis-Philippe of France was forced to flee before the anger of the people. The monarchy collapsed. The Second Republic was declared in France. The revolution that began in Paris would soon spread across all of Europe. The revolutions quickly reached Austria. The streets of Vienna filled with protests. Students and workers built barricades in the name of freedom. Metternich, one of Europe's most powerful men, was forced to flee. This moment symbolized the beginning of the collapse of old Europe. During the revolutions of 1848, the German people also wanted unity. Germany was still divided into dozens of small states. The idea of nationalism was growing. Many Germans dreamed of uniting under one flag. The Frankfurt Parliament gathered. Its goal was to create a free and united Germany. Although this movement failed, the idea of a united Germany could no longer be stopped. The revolutions of 1848 also shook Italy. Many Italians now dreamed of a united nation. Revolutionaries like Giuseppe Mazzini began organizing the youth of Italy. In northern Italy, the people rose against Austrian rule. The revolutions of 1848 failed, but the unification of Italy had already begun. Most of the revolutions of 1848 were quickly crushed. The kings regained control once again. The revolutionaries were divided among themselves. Workers, liberals, and nationalists did not share the same goals. Thousands of people were killed. Many revolutionaries were sent into exile. The revolutions appeared to have failed, but the ideas of freedom and nationalism could no longer be stopped. The revolutions of 1848 had failed, but Europe had already begun to change. Italy and Germany would unite in the years ahead. As nationalism grew, the great empires slowly began to weaken. The storm that began in 1848 would eventually lead Europe toward even greater wars. Napoleon was dead, but the ideas he spread continued to live on. The people now demanded freedom, constitutions, and national unity. The old order of Europe was beginning to collapse. The revolutions of 1848 appeared to fail, but they laid the foundations of modern Europe. And Europe would never be the same again. The revolutions of 1848 became one of the turning points in European history. Although they were defeated, the ideas of freedom could no longer be destroyed. Europe was entering the modern age. Industry, nationalism, and power struggles would reshape the world. And the changes that began in 1848 would one day lead to wars that changed the entire world. In 1848, people rose up across Europe. The continent was shaken by the fire of revolution. The ideas of freedom, constitutions, and nationalism inspired millions of people to rise. The kings crushed the revolutions, but the old order of Europe would never truly return. The revolutions of 1848 became the beginning of modern Europe and the great wars to come. The revolutions were over, but Europe was no longer the same. Industry was expanding, and railways were connecting the continent. Nationalism could not be stopped. Germany and Italy were moving toward unification. But a new rivalry was emerging across Europe. It would eventually affect the entire world. The revolutions of 1848 had failed, but some leaders had learned from them. A new power was rising in Prussia. It would change the destiny of Germany. The German states slowly began to unite. Nationalism was becoming a political force. Europe was entering a new era, and the rivalry between the great powers was growing stronger. What was only a dream in 1848 became reality in 1871. Italy united as well. Nationalism was redrawing the map of Europe. But for every winner, there were losers. Multi-ethnic empires were beginning to shake. The changes that began in 1848 would lead Europe toward a world war only decades later. The revolutions of 1848 did not affect only Western Europe. The idea of nationalism was spreading into Ottoman lands as well. Across the Balkans, many peoples began questioning their identity and future. Similar challenges were emerging in the Austrian Empire. Different nations were demanding greater rights. This was the greatest legacy of 1848. Nationalism had become an unstoppable force across Europe. Historians gave the revolutions of 1848 a name: the springtime of nations. Because millions of people were demanding freedom, constitutions, and national unity. The revolutions were crushed, but the ideas survived. 1848 was not a failed revolution. It was the birth pain of modern Europe. After 1848, Europe began to change. No ruler could completely silence the voice of the people anymore. Many countries introduced constitutional reforms. Parliaments became increasingly important. Industry was growing, and cities were expanding. Europe was becoming the economic center of the world. But a new rivalry was emerging among the rising powers. This rivalry was preparing the stage for future conflicts. The transformation that began in 1789 had shaken all of Europe by 1848. Freedom, constitutional government, and nationalism became the most powerful ideas of the 19th century. But these ideas did not bring unity alone. They also created new rivalries and conflicts. The revolutions of 1848 came to an end, but their legacy continued to shape the 20th century and the modern world.